Hey guys, Space Marine 658 here. Today we're going to be doing a little bit of a different thing. We're going to be sort of making a series within a series. So I'm working on our CommonUI series where I plan to cover a lot of different topics. I put out a poll, as you'll see here on the screen, and got a lot of good, people want to see a lot of different things. One of the big things is going to be the graphic settings, just settings in general, key rebinding. So if you ever want to make sure that you can be part of this voting, make sure to subscribe and just pay attention for the community tab because I'm always putting polls up there. But what we're going to actually do today is something a little bit different. So like I said before, we're doing a series within a series. So with that, we're going to be covering key binding and how to sort of set that up within CommonUI. What we're actually going to do is start the most important part, which is going to be our actual custom input selector. And work our way out. Now this is a very complex thing. Luckily CommonUI made a lot of it easier and it's a very robust system. The only problem is the current input selector that comes with it by default is just kind of very jank. It doesn't really work with CommonUI, at least I haven't been able to get it successfully to work. A lot of the gamepad navigation stuff just kind of breaks it. And so because of that, we're going to be creating our own. The cool thing is by doing that, this will allow you to, if you want to set actual key binding images instead of a button, you can absolutely do that. It's all extremely flexible. I'm just going to show you the very basics of setting it up with text, but absolutely you'll be able to extend it to however you need to once you actually have it in your hands. So let's go ahead and let me actually just pull up. I have my actual game on the right here, where I'm going to be sort of referencing as a guide to make sure I really guide you guys the correct way. But in keeping with that, we're going to want to make sure that we start at the most important point and work our way out. Now, it's going to be split up over multiple videos. I am going to release these as quickly as possible. My hope is to release them all either in a number of days or, even if I end up releasing them one after the other, I want to start with the most important part so that way we can kind of focus on that. Unfortunately, it's going to take a couple of videos just because of how much there is, just in general in creating a key binding system. But we're starting with the most new system, just because that way anyone who's following along who already knows how to do the other stuff can kind of handle it from there once they have the custom input selector set up. So let's go ahead and actually create that. So we're going to create a new folder and just call this Keybindings. Now what I've gone ahead and done in this default project is inside of my IMCs, I've just gone ahead and gone in, where is it? Here. Let me come back to here. So inside here, I've just gone ahead and, still not the right thing. There we go. There's one further back. Gone ahead and just set up some overrideable controls here. So basically all I've done is just given these some player mappable settings. That way once we load it up, we can actually see those once they make sense to see. And then we're going to come back in here, and we're going to go into our keybindings folder. Now we're going to create a new button base. This is going to be our custom input selector. So let's go ahead and create a new blueprint, and we're going to start off with our button base from CommonUI. And we're going to call this WBP _ custom selector. Alright, and now there's going to be a couple things we're going to need here. The usual overlay for our button. If I can drag it correctly. And we'll hit this and just give it a base button style. And then we're going to want to also give a text here, context. And we'll set that to be the middle. We don't have any styles currently. Of course, you want to set it style if you have style. For now, just leave it to default. Alright. And that is pretty much it for these. We'll want to make sure that we, let me see here, do I mark them as, yeah. So we'll want to make sure we mark our text as a variable here. And we'll just call this key text. So this is going to be the actual name for our keys, whatever is set to that binding. Now with this, because of the order we're actually going to create these in, just to ensure that these keys actually get the correct data, though there's no kind of wonkiness with our menu constructing and everything like that. We're going to actually create a custom event here. Instead of using the construct like you normally would do, we're actually going to create a custom event. And we're going to call this self-construct. We're doing it this way because we want to make sure that we're not running this while the button that's going to be above this, the key that's going to be above this, is in the middle of its construction process, because otherwise that can cause things where like keys are missing and things like that. So we're going to start with this. Now we're going to kind of keep this simple. There are ways to check for corded keys, and I do that in my game, but we're going to sort of avoid that and just kind of focus on the most important pieces here. So let me grab some of this because it'll be a little bit faster if I just grab it and paste it over rather than typing it all out. Now we want to get to the point where we have this information, right? These are the most important parts of our actual key system when we're first setting it up. So we need to get our mapping, we need to get our user settings, and then we need to actually set our key. Now the good thing is most of these are actually going to be passed in from the keys above. So let's go ahead and just set this self-construct to this key, and we're going to create a variable key. We're going to create a variable user settings and create a variable mapping. We want to make sure that these are set to instance editable and exposed on spawn. Alright, and that is actually a surprisingly large amount of what we need. All that is really left is just to actually set the text to the key. So we'll just grab this, and then for our keys, to make sure we are grabbing, because we just want to grab our key display name. So what we're doing here is we're going into our user settings and getting our current key profile. What this is doing is this going, hey, user settings, what is our currently saved profile? And then it goes, okay, I need to find a key mapping. So in that key mapping, we're looking for, and then in here, we're going and grabbing a mapping. This is what we've set to this particular key. So it says for this enhanced input mapping, this specific key, so let's say the action is tied to jump. So for the jump key, what is my key, which we're passing in here as the new key, even though it's already an existing key. We're looking in the first slot, and then we're just passing in the player mappable key settings from the jump key. So if we have the map settings set as jump, we're saying, hey, what's the jump or jump controller? What are we actually, looking at here? And it goes and it makes this map arg, and then it's going to go and actually find that. And once it actually finds that, it's going to return us some really useful data here. As you can see, we have a couple things. Let me actually grab this and over right here. So what it's doing is it's saying, hey, here's your mapping name, your display category of the slot. Is it dirty? Is it a default key? Is it the current key? Is there a hardware device ID and then an associated input action? So for example, if you wanted to check, is this a jump key? Maybe I want to do something special on the jump key. But for now, all we're worried about is the current key, because the way I've set this up, we're going to want to make sure that when we're first setting these up, we're getting whatever the current key is set to. The default is going to be your actual what you map in your editor, but the current key is whatever the players have saved as their current mapping. So you want to make sure you're showing them the current key. So now that we've got this all set up, there's a couple of things left to do. One thing we're going to want to do is set up a couple of other custom functions. So we'll go ahead and do custom event, and this is called listening. Now what's going to happen is we're going to fire this event whenever we want the player to input text into the key binding, whenever we are listening for their new key. And so to do that, we're just going to grab our key text, and we're going to set text like we did before. In fact, speaking of which, we need to do get display name, and put that here. Now with this, you can do some formatting on this. I do that by comparing it to a map I have in a blueprint function library, just seeing, if it equals gamepad controller face button down, it then changes it to A. Now, of course, you want to make sure that, depending on what console you're using and stuff, CommonUI has some stuff built in to handle it. For now, we're just going to leave it like this, but later on, you can do some formatting here. So let's go ahead and, for this listening, we're going to be setting this text. Let's actually just copy and paste this over. And we're going to pass in, call it select any key. And so what will happen is when we start listening, so basically once the player has clicked on a key to remap the input, it's going to pop up with this text in place of the original name of that key. And then we are going to create another custom function just below it. And this is going to be called update key. And for now, I'm going to skip checking for matches, but you can check for matches here at the beginning if you so choose to. But for now, let's actually just pass in a key. So what we're going to do is whenever this function is called, we're going to pass in a key, and we're going to call this key in. This is going to be our new key. This is going to be the one that we actually want to change things based off of. So let's go ahead and actually set our current key to this. And then we're going to want to come in, and in case this has changed, we will just grab this and we will just pass it in this way. So what this will do is this will update the key. So that way if the key has actually changed, we'll make any changes needed. All right. And then let's go ahead, and that should be almost everything we need. Yeah, that should be pretty much it, at least for the custom input selector. We'll want to actually go in, and now we're going to want to do a couple of things when it comes to the key that's going to actually have this inside of it. So let's go back, and we're going to create another base button. It's going to be another common base button, common button base from the CommonUI, and we're going to call this widget blueprint. I believe I called it in mine key button base, and of course I added a capitalized A there. We're going to open up this, and this one's got a few more things going on here, so there's a little bit more logic required to set this up, but nothing too crazy. So let's go to our graph, and the first thing we're going to want to do is come in here, and let's actually start with our construct, because we've got a couple of things going on here. So let's actually delete all of this. Now in our designer, we're going to want to, of course, give it our normal overlay, but we're going to do things a little bit differently when it comes to the actual text. So let's start with our overlay here, and we'll give it the base button style. But actually, let's go ahead, and I need to override this just to make sure that the custom input stands out a little bit. So we would call this, instead of base button style, we would call this keybinding button style. And it's going to be just a little bit different in that we're going to change this normal white to maybe a light cyan. And then let's go here and then change this to our key button. There we go. All right, one moment. Now we're going to want to add a horizontal box here. And within this is where we're going to actually store all of our text. So let's grab our common text here. And we'll just say this horizontal box, let's actually just put it in the middle with the text box there. And then we're going to want to get a copy of our WBP custom input selector. And we'll give it right here in the middle. Do that. And then maybe put a little spacer just so there's a little bit of room. We'll worry about any kind of resets and things like that at a later time. And we'll just set this to like fill, and we'll do custom on screen. Set this to like 400 by 50. Set that to fill. That's on auto. That is on auto. Alright. Now what we're going to want to do is basically go in and set up a couple of things related to our actual button text and kind of getting that default information set up. So let's go in here, and on construct we're going to get our button text. So let's actually make sure this is a variable. We'll just call this button text. And then for our custom input selector, we'll make that a variable, of course. And we'll just leave it called button selector. All right. So let's grab our button text, and we're going to get this, and we're going to set text. And I prefer to use the other one. I know it's the same, but this thing fits better. And we're going to want to actually create our text here just by having it passed in. The only things that are really going to be passed in here is going to be our button text, our mapping, and our user settings, because we're going to use those to actually define our other things. So let's go ahead and have that passed in here. And next we're going to create our mapping. So it's going to be an enhanced action key mapping, change variable. Oh, and I've done it a big disservice. I changed the wrong one. There we go. And we will call this mapping, because that's what we're getting. We're going to grab this, get mapping, and then we're also going to get our custom input selector and set the mapping that it has. There we go. Now we're going to want to also set its user input settings. Set user settings. And then we're going to want to call on this now that we've got our user settings, which we're going to be getting from our, we're actually going to have those as part of this as well, parental variable, which also needs to be passed in. Both of these do. Make sure they are also set to exposed on spawn. Compile and save. And what we're going to actually do is we're now going to actually call that self-construct variable we created earlier. Self-construct. And I think that is almost it. So all that's left now, what's going to happen is this is going to create everything, correct? But we want to be able to basically check if our key is actually updated. All right. So to kind of tell if a key has been updated, we're actually going to create a dispatcher here. So we actually go inside of our custom selector here. What we're going to want to do is on this update key actually call a event dispatcher. So we will just do something simple. We'll say like key updated. And then from here we can just call it on the end here, and that will just inside of our key button base we'll just have a listener here bound at the end. We're going to do some cool stuff with that in the next episode. but for now we will just get it set up with some basic stuff, just so that way we can have a print string here. So we'll just say key updated. And this will just print out, we'll just have a print string just saying key updated. This will just be a way for us to make sure that that function gets called. All right. Okay, so we have that key updated called. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of other things here. So to actually, make the button here click, we need to make sure that we actually, have the event triggered on click. Now, there's a couple things we can do here just to ensure that we always get, any kind of possible button that the player could hit. I've set up a few functions here that we're going to want to make sure that we hit all of these. Because there are, with CommonUI, because of the navigation rules, you want to make sure you handle any kind of possible input to really make sure that you get everything. And so let's go ahead and first we're going to actually set this to be select. So this is our triggering input action. So if that input action actually gets called, so we'll first do on click. So if that on click happens, or if we go in here in this override, we do input action triggered. So if either of these fire, we want to start listening for a key to input. So to do so, we're first going to need to actually have that listening variable, because we don't want to be actually doing any changes if we're not listening. So first we're going to promote to that variable, and we'll call this listening. And what we're going to want to do is, if we're not already listening, we're going to come down and just set listening to true, so that we can start listening. And then we're going to grab our custom input selector and tell it, hey, we're now listening. So it's going to call that function, so it'll display that text. And then on the upper half, now this one is a little more complex because what's essentially happening here is we're clicking the same button, basically the A or the left click, and so we want to tell it that that has been clicked if we are already listening. So the easiest way to do that is to actually pull from the common input, and we're going to want to get our common input subsystem. And from here you can do get current type, input type, and then we're going to do a switch. The reason we want to do this is because depending on which button you press, we're going to set it to a different key, right? So if you're left clicking, we don't want to set it to gamepad face button A, but we do want to set it to left mouse button if you're clicking with your left mouse button. So let's go ahead and we'll just grab our custom input selector, and we're going to call the key event update key. And from here, we're going to call it both on the mouse and keyboard as well as the gamepad. Of course, if you're doing touch or anything like that, you also want to be firing it there. Just any kind of system, whatever you're using. So do key and left mouse button for here, and for this one, this is going to be gamepad face button bottom. And then we're going to set listening to false. Now, right now, that means that this will work, but this will only work for that specific type of input. Now, of course, we want to do other things if those other different inputs are hit. Well, how do we do that? Well, there's a couple things you can do, but the big thing is we need to override and handle if any inputs are made. If you don't handle it, if you leave it unhandled, it'll bubble up so that it'll go up to the navigation, which of course is not what we want. So let's go ahead and go in here. We're going to override a couple of things. So first I'm going to override them, and then we're going to go through each one and actually figure out, what we need to do with those. So we're going to do on key down. We're going to override on key up, and we are going to override on analog. Now the reason why you need to do all of these is because if you don't, by default it will attempt to use those for CommonUI's input. The good thing is very simple how we're going to override it. So there's nothing complex. You're not going to have to do this with everything either. This is really only a situation where the input selector needs you to keep the input within itself. Otherwise, this isn't something that really ever gets fired normally. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go to our on key down, and we're going to just basically listen for a specific key if we are in listening mode. So let's go ahead and go to branch. And if we are already listening, we're going to grab our custom selector and we're going to call that key updated, or update key, sorry, on true. And we're just going to get the key event and get the key. And then from here, you'll just set listening to false, pass it back to here, and then handle it. So this will tell the UI, do not pass this input somewhere else. Now the problem is this won't catch every key. Unfortunately, with key up and key down and all of these, for some reason, at least with my testing, it won't catch everything in just a single function. Now that could have been some weirdness of mine. You can always try it out once you've got the basic setup, which I'm not quite done with, but once you got the basic setup, you can try it yourself. But for me, I couldn't get it to work with just the one override. From here, what we're going to want to also do is check if well, I don't think we necessarily need to do this. So if we're not listening, at this point we yeah, because I have an undo button, but we're not too worried about that right now. We'll worry about the undo button once we go back in and add some additional functionality in future videos. So for now, we'll just return this as unhandled. So now what we're doing here is basically just saying to the system, hey, we're not handling anything else additional here, so you feel free to use this for navigation or something. Since we're not listening anyways, that's perfectly acceptable. Now we're going to want to go on to our on key up, and basically this is identical, so you can go ahead and just copy everything over. If you do it like this, you should be good to just copy paste. So we'll go to on key up, we'll just delete that. I guess it won't let you until you have at least one other return node. And then we'll paste that like that. And then, there we go. And that should work. So that compile, yep. Now we're on the last one. Now that on analog value changed, first we're going to paste everything because it should just work as default, but there is going to be one minor difference here. So we'll just do this, grab this and delete it, drag this in. The only difference is going to be when you go to get the key, you do have to have it translated here into an analog, from an analog input structure into a key event structure. Otherwise, it's basically the same. So you go ahead and compile and save. And that should be pretty much it for that. All right, awesome. Now, as you'll probably notice, if we were to go ahead and try and start this, this wouldn't necessarily work out of the box. The reason for that is going to be when you hit A on any of these keys, it's always going to trigger the very first one. Because all of these are set to listen, it's basically going to the first one on the list and triggering it and saying, hey, listen to me, you need to take my input action. The problem is we don't want that to happen across the board to everything, right? So how do we actually make sure it only triggers on the ones we want it to trigger? Well, the good news is that should be relatively simple. If we go to our custom button base here, custom selector, we're going to want to go in and actually add the hovered and the unhovered options here. And then we're going to grab a reference to ourselves. And then, oh, sorry, I have misled you just a little bit here. We don't actually want it from our custom input. That's incorrect. My brain is just misremembering. If you come into here, and you're going to want to look for on hovered, there we go. That's the one we want. So we want on hovered and on unhovered. So these will fire specifically when this key itself is hovered and unhovered. Yeah. And then we're going to want to set our triggering input action. And this is where we're going to actually make our data table rows so that we can make sure we're receiving that select correctly. I'm going to go ahead and do a make data table row handle. Let's copy and paste that. And now what we kind of want to do is, for one of these, we want to have it actually, we input our data table right. We want to actually get the select key, so that way when we are hovered over this key, we actually are able to fire that. But when we are not hovered over it, we want to set it to none, because we want to make sure that we're unsetting that essentially from being able to be fired. That way it only fires on the one key that we actually want it to fire on. Now with this, we've got pretty much everything here for the key button base. So now it's going to become about how do we actually get these inside of our controls, right? So let's go ahead and what we're going to want to do is there's basically a couple things we want to set up. We want to set up a control widget, and that's going to handle basically loading in all of our keys here. And then from there, you can put that within a settings widget or a button within your settings widget. But for now, we're just going to focus on the actual controls here. So let's go ahead and go into our player menu here. And actually, instead of doing anything like this, let's just go in here and we'll just actually remove this. And we're going to add a widget switcher. For now, this isn't going to really do anything other than just being here. But in future videos, we're going to kind of cover what to do with this and how it works in a little bit more depth. So for now, we will put this here, and we're going to create a blueprint. And we're going to call it, we're going to go to Keybindings and create a blueprint called, and this needs to be an activatable widget. Common activatable widget. There we go. Because we want this to actually receive our input, it needs to be an activatable widget, otherwise it won't actually receive your input. We'll call this widget blueprint underscore control. Let's hit save all. And go ahead and open up that one. Now, with this one, we're going to have a couple of things here. The big focus is going to be on an S box here in the middle. But first, let's add our common border. And we'll just grab one of our styles, like base border style as an example. And then within this, we're going to have a vertical box. And we're going to add some common text here. And this is going to be just in the middle, and we'll just call this something like keybindings. Because you could have, sensitivity and other control settings in here, which we're going to talk about more in the future as we add detail here. But for now, we're just going to call it keybindings. And then inside of here, we're going to have a S box, scroll box. Now there are a couple of options for what you exactly use. Personally, the common one is going to be probably your best. While it doesn't actually, it's called a common. I'm trying to remember, hierarchical. scroll box. It doesn't add a ton as far as the actual stylization goes. So as you can see here, you don't actually get a style setting that's separate from it, but it just is designed to work with the common input, so you kind of scroll through objects that are in here. And then we're going to also add a button base. Now, we're not going to worry about this one right now, but I'm adding it here just so that you guys are aware for future. This is going to be our restore to default key. And this will just handle resetting our keys back to the default bindings. So let's go ahead and go in here. We're actually set this up with a little bit of information here. So the first thing we're going to want to do before we actually get too deep into setting up our keys here is we're going to want to override our get desired focus target. This needs to be something that your keys can focus on. So you want to set it to a button or something like that. What you can do is what I prefer to do is if you have a button that's at the top or some kind of like slider or something, setting that as the object, the desired focus object, is usually best. So that way your players start at the top and work their way down. And of course, you can have buttons they can hit that'll kind of jump them around. For example, the start button might jump them to the save, or things like that to kind of make UI navigation a little bit easier. For now, we'll just set this like this. And then what you want to do on your construct, sorry, actually we want to do this on activated. We'll just do get desired focus, and we will set focus. That way when this widget gets activated, it'll automatically set that as our active. Now let's go ahead and get started on our pre-construct. Now we want to go ahead and, because our key, right, remember how it needs a user setting, we're going to go ahead and basically get that going. So I'm actually going to copy and paste a function here from my game. So get user input settings. This is another one that is very complicated, but also simple at the same time. So we're going to talk through it here. Now this one is one that will really depend on your game in a way. Actually, make sure I copied the correct keys here. So as you can see here, we're doing a couple of things. We're getting the player controller and the enhanced local player subsystem, and then we're getting the user settings from that, and then we're actually setting a reference to it. This is what we're going to pass to our other keys. But before we pass it, we need to make sure that all of our mappings are actually registered. Now you need to do this with every single mapping. So if you have more than one, you can actually go in and actually pass in multiple. But you can only do one registration at a time. So let's first kind of hook things up and get these variables created. So we have that. And then we're just basically going to copy and paste everything but this first part. So Control-C, Control-V. And then this is going to be the weapons. So if you're working with multiple contexts, which is what I'm going to show how to do here, it's actually simpler if you're using a single context, and you'll be able to tell the parts where you only need a single context. And I'll kind of point them out as well. But if you're working with multiple contexts, I'm going to show you how to do it because it is a little bit more complicated, but it's not too bad. The big thing is just you need to make sure that they're registered correctly and all that. So let's go ahead and, so what you're doing here is we're coming into our user settings, checking if it's already registered. If it's not already registered, then we want to go ahead and actually register it. If it is registered, of course, we can just ignore it, but if it is not yet registered, we want to make sure that we're carrying on through. All right. So you can see here we now have these both registered if they aren't already. Let's go ahead and save that. Now that will get us our user settings here on construct. So we can get user input settings. That will get us everything we need there. The next big thing is going to be getting our actual keys themselves. So in our event construct, we're going to want to actually get our keys, but we're also going to want to do another couple of things within that get keys. So let's go ahead and create a function called get keys. And let me actually open that up here. Now, this is where if you're doing it for a single context, you can just go in here and off of a single context, input mapping context. Let's get the name of context. And for now, set to IMC default. If you're just using the single one, you can just pull off mappings here and just go straight into the for loop. But if you're doing multiple, you need to make sure that you're getting all of the possible mappings. So let's go ahead and set up that scenario, since we do have it here in this first person project. Let's go ahead and change it to an array. Now in here, I'm going to set up both of these, IMC default and IMC weapons. And we're going to do a for each loop, get keys. From here, we're going to get our mappings. Now what we want to do is basically do another for each loop. And then, there we go. So what this is going to do is, for each of our contexts, we're going to loop through all of our possible mappings. And this is where we're actually going to set up our keys. So we go ahead and break this here. And let's go ahead and also off of here get our player mappable key settings. So that's what I was talking about earlier with the where I gave them names and things like that. That's what you want to make sure. Now what you want to do is, there may be keys where you don't want to actually map to them, whether it's like accesses or things like that. Things where you don't want to actually have players change those, or at least not easily. Maybe you want to have a little bit more advanced logic around changing those. So what we can do is we can just go ahead and check and make sure that this is not empty. And so long as this isn't empty, we're going to go ahead and actually create the key image. So let's actually grab our display name, since we know we're going to need that as well. And then we're going to grab our user input settings, because we know we're going to want to plug that in here as well. And with that, we're going to want to create widget, and we're going to want to select our key button base. Now, unfortunately, because it is a CommonUI button with a lot in it, there is going to be a long launcher list that you can't really hide much of. But luckily, we don't need to worry about a whole lot of it. The big thing is going to be the top part here. Make sure we're plugging this all in. So we want to give it the in-text, and we want to give it the mapping. And that should be pretty much it, because it'll pull a key from the mapping. Now what we want to do is grab our box over here, our scroll box, which we'll set to a variable called sBox. If we get that, then we can actually add a child to it. So we'll add a child and set the content as that. Boom, there we go. Now, you're not going to see anything populate here, because you actually have to be in the game to get these keys to populate. Get keys. Now you might ask yourself, well, if you do this, right, and because it doesn't necessarily deconstruct in the same way a lot of other UI does, you're going to repeatedly get keys over and over and over. So what we want to do is actually make sure that when our event destruct, which for common widgets is not actually destructing it, it's just deactivating it, essentially hiding it away until it needs to bring it back forward again. So what we want to do actually here is call clear children. So we grab our sBox and we call clear children. This will make it so that on destruct it'll actually clear that out. That way you don't have a big old list of items there. Now with that, the way I've got it set up, you need to actually save to save your changes. So if you make some changes and don't save it, I have in my game a warning that kind of shows players, but it's up to you if you want the warning or not. But if you don't call that save, then it'll just wipe out any of your changes. All right. So let's see here. That should be almost everything. All that is really left here is going to be actually a couple of things regarding saving. But let's go ahead and I think this should be enough to at least test out, make sure we're on the right path. So let's go to our player menu here, make sure we have everything set up correctly. Yeah, so it should go to 0. And then we are going to, what we're going to want to do is actually add our control blueprint, widget blueprint to here. There we go. That way, if we go into here, we hit 1, we should see that appear. All right, it's a little crowded because I haven't really set up, any kind of spacing or anything correctly, but as you can see here, we have our 2 jump keys that we set, and then our 2 fire. Now you see here we're getting none for the actual key bindings, whatever's set currently, and we're getting some errors here. Unable to read property user settings, and then returning get current key profile. So yeah, so somewhere we're not passing in our user settings quite correctly. So basically our custom selector here is not getting the keys. So let's go ahead and figure out, okay, so where are we missing it? So my assumption would be, without actually knowing for 100% certain, is that we didn't set it up in our key button base. So we look here, okay, so we have our user settings, and it looks like we are passing it in here. So this is probably correct, okay. So if we go back one more step, so if we're looking at our control here, so if we're getting our user input settings on pre-construct, then we should be getting them and setting them here. And then on get keys, we should be passing them in. So, as far as I can tell, everything looks correct. So let's go ahead and actually see what's going on here by adding a breakpoint. Now, if we look in here, it's returning an unknown, which means we probably have an issue where we actually are not getting the enhanced user settings correctly. So let's go ahead and stop this here. Yeah, as you can see, it's calling to it, but it's not actually getting it correctly. So let's remove this breakpoint. So we look here, we've got our player controller, we've got our enhanced input local player subsystem, we get our enhanced input user settings. Well, there's a couple of different things that could be going on here. What we want to do is make sure that we have our user settings actually set as enabled. So as you can see here, because I didn't have it enabled, I didn't actually have it activatable within here. So let's go ahead and close that. Now if we go and hit play, as you can see, all of our buttons appear here. All right, perfect. So let's go ahead and take a look. So now we've got it set up. So now if we're loading in right, we're getting our menu. Let's full screen this just so that way we can make sure we can see everything. All right, let's go ahead and hit 1. So if we see here, we've got our buttons showing correctly. So if I hover over here, it's actually showing up correctly, changing that style. Now, unfortunately, the styles are very similar, so they're blending in. Let's go ahead and click here. Now you see here, it's calling key updated immediately, instead of actually triggering it and only calling it whenever we actually need it to be called. So what's happening here is it's basically listening and then immediately firing and updating the key. So let's go ahead and if we come in here, one thing we can do is let's go ahead and make sure that it's not double firing something like this. So it seemed to be setting up the left mouse button every time. So as you see, okay, so that wasn't at least the problem, at least from what I can tell. All right. So it's actually a pretty simple issue. Took me just a second just to do a little debugging. I just want to make sure I did it off camera. You probably didn't have this issue, but for me, I accidentally left listening as on by default. So what's just happening is it's just always, listening constantly. So let's go ahead and try it out now. As you can see, it'll show selecting a key, and if I hit, like, for example, number 5, boom, key updated. So that's a relatively simple, straightforward issue there. Sorry about that. Now the cool thing is, because we've set this up using CommonUI, it actually works with mouse as well. So if I go ahead and hit A right here, and then we'll select the Y key, boom, that changes it. If I go ahead and let's do, so you can see here, there is an issue where it is only selecting the top key. Now what's going on here is it's basically firing off the input action there only for the top one. Now we did set up some stuff there to try and mitigate that, but of course, as you're probably aware, that doesn't always actually fix things. So let's go ahead here and figure out, so it's triggering this even though it should be triggering on the correct key. So what it means is we probably set up this incorrectly, where we've probably got the input row activated somehow when it shouldn't. So if we go in here, go take a look at our, so you see here we have nothing here. It's all set as default. Triggering input action set to none. What if we come in here? As you can see here, we've got this set as select. So why don't we go ahead and just clear this out entirely. So we come back and let's go ahead and hit play. Hit 1, and if we grab our controller, let's go ahead and hit A. That works. Let's go ahead and hit A here. And boom, as you can see, because we set up that default, it actually blocks you from resetting that. So that's important that you remember that you have that set as none. That way you can go ahead and actually change that there. All right, so we are 99% of the way there. All that is really left, is how do we actually save this, right? So we want to save upon completing all of these changes, right? Because right now we're just kind of stashing it inside that custom button there, inside that custom input selector. So let's go ahead and actually look at how we're going to save the changes that we've made. So what we're going to want to do is go to our control here, bring this up, go to our event graph. Now what I do is I save it across all of my different menu options. So I just call an interface that calls out to every single option that I have under my tab widget switcher, and I just basically say save your UI, and so it'll do everything on its own. But for now, just for simplicity's sake, we will focus more on just having a save button that is directly right here. So let's go ahead and just hit save changes. Now what we want to do is when this triggers, so on clicked, we want to actually save the different changes that are within each of their custom input selectors. So let's go ahead and dive into that. So let's grab this, and what we're going to want to do is, so oops, not that. We want to grab our S box, and from our S box we want to drag off get all children, and then we're going to call into a for loop for each loop. From here, now we're going to want to, since this is already going to be loaded into memory, we're just going to cast to a keybind base. Now I know there's a big pushback recently against casting, and the thing is, casting is useful when it's something that's already going to be loaded in memory. Of course, if it's not going to be loaded into memory, you want to avoid casting. You want to use either dispatchers or interfaces, but for things like this where it's literally integral to being part of this UI, a cast is perfectly fine, because any changes I make here are going to be integral to this entire system anyways, so I'll want to know when this kind of breaks. From here we're going to pull out our mapping, So we're going to get our mapping. We're also going to get our custom input selector. And then from our custom input selector, we'll want to get our key. And then from our mapping, we also want to get our player mappable key settings. Now what we're going to want to do is get our name. Remember how we talked about how our name needs to be unique? This is how we actually get our keys so that we can uniquely find whatever needs to be overridden. So we're going to make map player keys arg, and we're going to go into the first slot because I only store one single slot. And then our new key is going to come from here. We won't worry about the rest of that for now. And then we're going to grab our user input settings, get that, and we're going to map player key. And what this will do is this will override our current key that exists there, right? Now, I have seen some people that have had issues where they would map and it would have both keys working at the same time. Likely that's due to you're setting this slot. This needs to be specified to the first slot because of just how the mapping system works. If you're going to use these other slots, you need to understand how the slot system works and what the key mapping is. Otherwise, I would just always leave it to the first anytime you touch it. So for now, we'll just leave it to that. Now what you want to do is, now that we've gotten all of these and we've mapped them right, that's not enough to actually save them into your settings. So we're going to go ahead and actually come down here and call get game user settings. And first we're going to apply it. Technically you can do this at the end. I like to do it here at the beginning. But this is for any other changes you make. So if you're doing any kind of graphical changes or anything like that, that's where you'll apply them with this. But as far as the actual keys, we're going to do get our user input settings, and we're going to call apply settings. So this will apply our key changes. So if you only wanted to apply but not actually save, you could have that be a separate button to only call the apply settings, and then you could have a separate button to call your save settings. You can save settings. Now, there's two ways to do this. There's the synchronous and the asynchronous. The benefit of doing the asynchronous is that basically if there are more options, for example, if the player is changing a lot of options, sometimes that save settings could just halt the system for just a split second. But honestly, most of the time, I'd rather be synchronous to guarantee it saved and that everything worked correctly. Just because the player's not going to care if there's a momentary hitch when you're saving your settings. It's kind of expected. Most games have a slight hitch whenever you save your settings. But yeah, that should be pretty much everything we need from here. So if we go ahead and go back into here, and let's actually go ahead and try to change one of our settings here. And before I do that, let me go ahead and close down my editor there. I had my other editor up because this should be pretty much it. It'll help it run a little faster. So let's go ahead and open it. Now what we want to do here is let's change our jump button to numpad 1 and hit save changes and then hit resume. Now if I hit the 1 key, it opens up my menu because that's the button I'm used to, but I also jump. So let's actually set that to 2 and then save changes. Now as you can see, if I hit the space bar, nothing happens at all, but if I go ahead and run up here and hit 2, boom, I'm jumping around. But yeah, that is the most absolute bareback, stripped back, basic version of getting key binding working in CommonUI. Of course, my next episode, like I said, I'm going to try and get out as soon as possible. It may not be till next Monday because I am going on vacation. But my plan is to cover in more detail all of the extra things, resetting all your key bindings, clearing out any kind of changes, showing reset buttons, things like that. So if you want to see that, definitely subscribe. You'll definitely get a notification if you do so, especially if you hit that bell icon. Otherwise, good luck and good hunting.